Welcome to Tales That Terrify, the podcast that turns your deepest fears into chilling reality. Every week, we bring you fresh, unsettling stories designed to haunt your imagination. From whispers in the dark to the horrors just beyond your sight, these tales will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows. Want more nightmares? Dare to explore our YouTube channel for even more spine-tingling stories. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for this week's descent into terror. I should have known better, but being the way I am, curious, adventurous, and honestly, a little too trusting, I booked the weekend in the city. A friend from college had found this place, some old building tucked away on a forgotten street near the edge of downtown. It was cheap, quirky, and fit into my vintage, history nerd, eco-friendly aesthetic perfectly. Plus, I'd been trying to get more into real environmental activism lately, and what better way to get away than to immerse myself in history while being environmentally conscious? The Airbnb listing said it was a refurbished building, an old row house turned into apartments, repurposed and sustainably designed. That was more than enough for me. When I showed up on Friday night, the city seemed unusually quiet, almost suffocatingly so. A fog rolled in from the river, curling itself between buildings like it was alive. I thought, okay, maybe it's just the vibe of the place. After all, it was an older part of town, and fog had a certain romantic, noir-ish appeal. But something felt off, like the city's heartbeat had slowed down to something unnatural. The host, an older man with a graying beard, met me at the door and handed over the keys. His eyes were a bit too intense, but I chalked it up to him just being a little eccentric. He mumbled something about the house having a unique history, and advised me to avoid the basement. It was out of bounds, he said, and quickly ushered me in. I'm no stranger to a weird place, especially when it's historical and packed with potential stories. I figured I'd explore tomorrow, maybe take a look at the old furniture, or dig through some books, get some inspiration for a new sci-fi story. The apartment was quaint, the perfect mix of old-world charm and modern sensibility. There were vintage pieces scattered around, antique desks, an old velvet armchair in the corner, framed black and white photographs hanging from the walls. The wooden floors creaked beneath my boots, and the furniture had this kind of lived-in warmth that made me feel comfortable, like I'd found a piece of the past I could actually inhabit. The windows were tall, almost like in those old films where people stare out dramatically. I couldn't help but feel like a character in one of my favorite retro-futuristic stories, like I was in a moment frozen between time. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and plopped into the armchair with a book. Something dark. I wasn't sure if it was the city's eerie stillness or the way the fog made everything look like it was from another era, but I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. It didn't feel like mine. I went to bed early, thinking I'd catch up on sleep after a busy week. The bed was large, soft, too soft. It almost felt like it swallowed me, and as soon as I lay back, I felt that weird, restless feeling creep into my bones. Maybe it was the history of the place, or maybe just the thought of how old the building was, the lives it had seen pass through, the echoes of people long gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was only as I started to settle in that I noticed the restraints. They were barely visible at first. Old leather straps tucked underneath the bed, just out of sight, but not quite hidden. I was no stranger to bondage. Of course, being into alternative lifestyles was nothing to hide, but these weren't the kinds of restraints I usually dealt with. These were worn, frayed, and smelled faintly of something that wasn't just leather. It, whatever it was, felt ancient, like they'd been there for years, decades, waiting for someone to come along. I didn't think too much about it at first. I had my own history with old things, after all. Things left behind by others, people who lived differently than I did, people who had their own lives and left their mark. Maybe it was just part of the place's charm. But then came the dreams. I'm not sure when I fell asleep. Maybe it was when the clock struck midnight, or perhaps I'd drifted off in the middle of my book. But when I did, it was like I was pulled into something else entirely. It wasn't just a dream, not exactly. It was like being stuck in a memory that wasn't mine, where I was someone else, Someone who had lived in this very room before me. A woman, I think. Older perhaps, but with a look of intense longing in her eyes, staring at the same leather straps that were beneath my bed. But these straps were newer, tighter. She was waiting for something, for someone. Her hands tied, her body shivering with anticipation. Or maybe few hard to tell. And the fog. There was always fog in the dream, rolling through the streets, curling around the windows like it wanted to pull her back into the past. I woke up with my heart pounding, eyes wide. The room was just as it had been when I fell asleep. Quiet, cold, but the straps were gone. I checked under the bed. Nothing. The floor was bare, the wood old and creaky but untouched. I tried to shake off the feeling, but as I lay there in the dark, a strange sensation settled in. The fog outside had thickened, and I could barely see the streetlights through the glass. But then, a sound, a creak, from the floorboards, like someone was walking around in the room. The same kind of sound I'd heard before when I first moved in, those strange, haunted noises from the old house, the house that had lived for centuries. I was almost too scared to move. My hands were frozen on the sheets. My body was shaking, but I had to know what was happening. Slowly, I stood up and crept to the window. The fog swirled and danced below, but there, across the street, a figure, a woman. She was staring right at me, unmoving, and then her mouth opened, but she didn't speak. She just pointed at the basement door. I didn't have the courage to leave after that. I knew deep down that there was something in that basement I was never supposed to find. Maybe it was the spirits of the people who had once lived here, or maybe something darker, something more ancient that had been hidden away for centuries. But I could feel its pull, a magnetic force that made it impossible to resist. But for the rest of the weekend, I stayed in my room. I didn't venture into the basement. The air was thick with anticipation, and every time I tried to go back to sleep, I was pulled back into those dark, twisting dreams. The fog never lifted, and the feeling of being watched never left. By Sunday, I was ready to leave. I packed my things quickly and left the keys on the kitchen counter. The host didn't even look up when I slipped out the door. As I walked away, I glanced back at the old building one last time. It loomed there, quiet as ever, but somehow watching. I knew I'd never return. Some places were meant to stay locked away in the past.
I had never been so close to the wild in the middle of a city. Eden Park, with its sweeping views of the Ohio River and the city skyline, had always been a peaceful escape for me, until tonight. I had been working late at the office, the kind of shift that stretches on long into the night. By the time I left, the city was wrapped in a blanket of silence, the streets empty except for the occasional stray car. I needed to clear my head, so I took a detour through Eden Park. It was only a short walk, just enough to breathe deeply and escape the grip of the day. I thought it'd be peaceful, as usual. It wasn't. The moment I entered the park, something felt off. The air felt heavier, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had faded into an eerie hush. The city lights seemed distant now, the only illumination coming from the dim path lights that flickered on the perimeter of the park. I pushed on, shrugging off the growing unease. I walked toward the overlook, where the city stretched below me, but something caught my eye. A shadow, dark against the dim trees. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I saw it again, closer this time. A shape, moving swiftly, too fast to be a normal animal. My heart skipped a beat as the outline became clearer, and I saw the unmistakable silhouette of a coyote, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I froze. Coyotes weren't unheard of in Cincinnati, but I had never seen one here in the park. And this one wasn't alone. From the corner of my eye, I noticed another, and another. I tried to count them, but the shadows blurred into the darkness, a pack now closing in around me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. Coyotes, normally wary of humans, never acted this bold. I took a cautious step backward, hoping to retreat slowly without alarming them. But then, the ground underfoot shifted. My foot pressed into the dirt where there shouldn't have been loose earth. I looked down just as the ground buckled, revealing a hole, large, jagged, and deep. My breath caught in my throat. The pack circled around me, their movements deliberate. They weren't just following their instincts. They were watching me, waiting. I could hear the faint sound of their low growls, almost like a rhythm, like they were communicating with each other. I knew I had to move fast. My hand instinctively went to my side, but there was no weapon. I was unarmed. Panic surged through me as I realized the situation. I couldn't outrun them, not with my heart pounding this hard. Then there was a noise, more than a growl. It was a scream, a human scream, thin and shrill, echoing from the trees. The pack stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the sound. I could hear the rustling in the underbrush, the sudden shift of heavy footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows, not another coyote, but something far worse, a man. A figure, gaunt and hunched, dressed in tattered clothing, eyes wide with a feral gleam. He was grinning. Not a sane grin, one twisted with something darker. "The coyotes know you now," he whispered, his voice ragged. "They're not just animals. Not anymore." The pack closed in tighter, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The man's grin widened as he took another step forward, his breath ragged and uneven. "You're not alone here," he said, and as he spoke, I could see it. The pack was more than just predators. They were part of something larger, an unnatural bond. They were hunting. Not for food, but for something else. Something far more dangerous. I needed to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I had never felt such a crushing, primal fear before, something deeper than survival. The pack was waiting, their eyes glowing like twin orbs of light in the night. I turned on my heels and bolted, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind a blur. But the sound of the coyotes following, their paws quick against the earth, filled the air around me. The man's voice echoed after me, a laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Run," he taunted. "It's already too late." I didn't stop. I couldn't. My feet hit the pavement hard, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. But as I reached the exit, the distant sound of their howls followed me, growing fainter, yet not fading. As I stepped onto the street, I dared to glance back. The park, bathed in city light, seemed completely empty, eerily still. The coyotes were gone, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning into my back, always watching, always waiting. And as I made my way home, the silence of the city no longer felt comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm. I don't walk through Eden Park anymore, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear their howls, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting.
I should have known better. The rent was too cheap, the cottage too quaint, and the woods too quiet. But I was desperate for a fresh start, a place to escape the noise and chaos of the city. So I packed my bags, grabbed my dog, Jax, and moved into the little cottage nestled deep in the forest. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be safe. But it wasn't. The first few days were uneventful. The cottage was small but charming, with its wooden beams, stone fireplace, and large windows that let in the golden light of the forest. Jax seemed to love it, bounding through the trees and sniffing at every bush and rock. I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. But that calm didn't last. It started with the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, creaking branches, the occasional call of a distant bird. But this was different. The whispers were low and rhythmic, like a chant, and they seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I'd hear them when I was chopping wood outside, or when I was washing dishes in the kitchen. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they sent a chill down my spine. Jax noticed them too. He'd stop in his tracks, ears perked, head tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't quite hear. Then he'd growl, a deep, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He'd stare into the shadows of the forest, his body tense, his eyes wide with fear. I tried to reassure him, to tell myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers grew louder at night. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried a weight, a meaning that I couldn't quite grasp. They felt like a warning, a plea, a threat. I'd pull the blankets tighter around me, trying to block them out, but they only grew more insistent. One night, I woke to the sound of Jax barking. It wasn't his usual bark, it was frantic, panicked. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and called his name. He didn't come. The barking continued, but it sounded distant, as if he were far away. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and hurried outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. "Jax!" I called, shining the flashlight into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled trunks and tangled underbrush. The forest was eerily silent, save for the sound of Jax's barking. I followed the sound, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me like a swarm of invisible insects. I found Jax at the edge of the property, near the old well. He was crouched low to the ground, his fur bristling, his teeth bared. He was staring at something in the shadows, something I couldn't see. I called his name again, but he didn't move. He just kept growling, his eyes fixed on the darkness. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a cold, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I shone the light into the shadows, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A shape, dark and formless, moving just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Jax, come on!" I shouted, my voice shaking. He finally turned and bolted toward me, his tail between his legs. We ran back to the cottage, the whispers following us, growing louder and more insistent with every step. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with Jax curled up beside me, both of us staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The whispers continued, soft and relentless, filling the cottage with their eerie, otherworldly sound. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I decided to explore the well. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I needed to prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. But as I approached the well, I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The whispers were quieter now, but they were still there, a constant, unsettling presence in the back of my mind. The well was old, its stones covered in moss and ivy. The wooden cover was cracked and splintered, and when I lifted it, a cold, damp smell wafted up from the darkness below. I shone my flashlight into the well, but the beam didn't reach the bottom. It was like staring into an abyss. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the whispers, maybe it was the sense of dread that had been building inside me, but I picked up a stone and dropped it into the well. I listened as it fell, the sound echoing in the darkness. And then, just as the sound faded, I heard something else, a soft, wet sound, like something moving in the water below. My heart raced, and I took a step back from the well. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a cold, prickling sensation on my skin. I turned and ran back to the cottage, Jax at my heels. I didn't look back. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. They filled the cottage, swirling around me like a storm. I tried to block them out, to focus on the sound of Jax's breathing, but they were relentless. They seemed to be calling my name, urging me to listen, to understand. I felt like I was losing my mind. And then, I saw it. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I noticed a shadow moving on the wall. It was darker than the others, a black, formless mass that seemed to pulse with malevolence. I sat up, my heart pounding, and watched as it slid across the wall, inching closer to me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a cold, suffocating pressure in the air. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The shadow loomed over me, stretching toward me like a hand reaching out from the darkness. And then, just as it was about to touch me, it stopped. The whispers fell silent, and the shadow retreated, sliding back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my things as soon as the sun rose, my hands trembling as I shoved clothes and books into bags. Jax watched me, his ears flat against his head, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't care about the rent, the deposit, any of it. I just wanted to get out. But as I drove away from the cottage, the whispers followed me. They were softer now, almost imperceptible, but they were there, a constant, unsettling presence in the back of my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was just tired, but I knew better. The shadows had found me, and I knew they wouldn't let me go. Weeks passed, and the whispers never left. They were always there, a faint, insistent murmur in the back of my mind. I tried to ignore them, to focus on my new life in the city, but they were relentless. Jax felt it too. He'd sit by the window, staring out into the night, his ears twitching as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was in that cottage, in that well. I packed a bag, grabbed Jax, and drove back to the forest. The cottage looked the same as I'd left it, quiet and still, but I could feel the presence of the shadows as soon as I stepped inside. I went straight to the well. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, and I felt a cold, prickling sensation on my skin. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, and this time I saw something, a glimmer of light, deep below. It was faint, but it was there, a small, flickering beacon in the darkness. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the whispers. Maybe it was the sense of dread that had been building inside me, but I climbed down into the well. The stones were slick with moss, and the air was cold and damp, but I kept going, driven by a force I couldn't explain. At the bottom of the well, I found a small, hidden chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a stone altar. On the altar was a small, glowing orb, pulsing with a soft, golden light. The whispers were louder here, but they were different now, softer, more melodic, almost like a song. I reached out and touched the orb, and in an instant, the whispers stopped. The shadows retreated, and the air felt lighter, warmer. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. I don't know what the orb is, or why it was hidden in the well, but I know it's important. I took it with me, and the whispers haven't returned. Jax seems happier too, more relaxed, like a weight has been lifted from his shoulders. I still don't know what was in the shadows, or why they were following me, but I feel like I've found a piece of the puzzle. And for now, that's enough. The cottage is quiet, the forest is peaceful, and the whispers are gone. But I know the shadows are still out there, waiting, watching, and one day I'll have to face them again. And that concludes this week's chilling journey into the unknown. We hope these tales have left you looking over your shoulder and questioning the darkness around you. Craving more horror? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for even more terrifying tales. Until next time, remember, there are always more nightmares waiting to be told.